Hello, I'm Tim Fulford, and I've been teaching at Montfort since 2012. I teach in the Department of English Literature, and my interest in decolonisation is that I study the history of the acquisition of colonies by Britain from the period of about 200 years ago, the period when they had slave plantations in the West Indies and when Britain gradually conquered most of India. And I've written a number of books about that subject, so this little presentation tells you a little bit about my research and then something about my teaching. I published this book, Romanticism and Colonialism, in the 1990s. It's a study of the acquisition of colonies by Britain and of writing about that thing. And one of the things that it does is look at opposition to colonialism in the 1790s and early 1800s. It looks at a series of poets and political writers who were very much against the acquisition of empire and who took up the cause of enslaved Africans in particular and represented what they thought were their points of view. So it looks at a number of poets who wrote very strongly against colonialism and wrote about the consequences to enslaved people of what was happening. This is another book that I published in the 2000s with Oxford University Press, Romantic Indians. It's a study of Native Americans in the era of 200 years ago and the way that they were represented in fiction, in poetry, and also in political writing. It looks at the way that in the 1770s, Native Americans, Indians, were the strongest and most powerful force in North America, and how over the next 30 years their power became gradually diminished and removed. And along with this arose racist attitudes towards them. They were termed savages, they were termed infants, they were termed children. And a number of arguments were put forward by white people that were very self-serving, such as the argument of manifest destiny, which said that Indians, being children and unsophisticated and savage, would kind of naturally die out in competition with the advanced civilization of white people. So it was nobody's fault if they died of smallpox or were removed from their land. They just weren't fit enough to survive. So the book looks at the advancing of that argument by a number of white racists in the period, but it also looks at a number of Indian writers, Native American writers, who learnt English, learnt to read and write, and protested against this stereotyping, who found voices and contested the colonialist voice of white people who wanted their land. So this book celebrates a number of Native American writers, including George Copway and William Apess. At De Montfort, my research feeds into my teaching, and this is one of the modules that I've designed and that I teach, Sex and Death in Romantic Era Writing, 1780 to 1830. And in this module, which I teach currently, we feature the rise of colonialism and the consequences that that had upon colonized people, the rise of racism, casual racism, but also institutional and scientific racism, as colonialists gave themselves excuses to rule black people in the West Indies and to enslave people and to subjugate people in the Indian subcontinent. We also look at a number of writers who resisted this stereotyping and resisted colonialism. Here's one of them, Olaudah Equiano, who was a black slave who earned his freedom and became a writer and a traveller, and wrote his own autobiography and became a campaigner against slavery. So we look at his writings in the module and the way they contest racist stereotypes. And we also look at this man. This is Thomas Clarkson, another hero, I think, a man who spent much of his life tirelessly gathering evidence against the slave trade. He was a great campaigner to bring an end to slavery. He conducted thousands of interviews, often in circumstances of great danger to himself, with sailors who were part of the fleet that brought slaves from Africa to the West Indies and then the goods to Bristol, so as he could find out about conditions on the slave ships and use these as evidence against the slave trade. He also stood in testament to the ingenuity, skills, and civilization of black countries in Africa, so as to contest racist views that black people were savages and primitive. So that's Thomas Clarkson. And I think now that the Black Lives Matter movement has led to the removal of Colston's statues in the city of Bristol, Colston the merchant who made lots of money out of the slave trade before donating some of it to good causes in Bristol. Now his statue has been removed, I think Clarkson would be a good contestant to replace Colston on the podium where the statue used to be. Clarkson, who sacrificed a lot of his personal happiness and health to a lifelong campaign to bring about the end of slavery. So we study him in the module, and we study a number of writers: William Blake, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Robert Southey, who spoke out and wrote against slavery, and a number of writers, Equiano, but also Phyllis Wheatley, black writers who found their voices during this period.